Hi, everybody. Welcome to Yachatz, the fourth installment in the Web Yeshiva series on the Seder. My name is Ilana Goldstein Saks. So Yachatz, that's the point in the Seder where we take the middle matza of the three matzot that we have on the table, and we break it in half. Yachatz, of course, is from the root chatza, right, which means to break in half, to split in half. And it seems it's very appropriate that we do that for a couple of reasons. First of all, the main reason, the explicit reason that we split the matzah in half is stated right after we do that, right? At the very beginning of Magid, we explain what exactly it is that we just did. We say, Ha lachma anya, di achalu av hatana be'ara di Mitzrayim. This is the lachma anya, the lechem oni. We'll talk more about that in a moment, which our forefathers ate in the land of Mitzrayim. Now that sentence requires a lot of explanation. It's not as simple as one might think. So first of all, let's try to understand what exactly lachma anya is. What is lechem oni? So it actually comes from a pasuk in the Torah. There's one place in the Torah where matzah is referred to as lechem oni. In the book of Dvarim, I apologize, I forgot to write that it's from Dvarim. It says lo tochal alav chametz. It's talking about the Korban Pesach. That you're not allowed to have chametz with your korban pesach. Lo tochal alav chametz shivat yamim tochal alav matzot. Right. So this sentence, as we will see, is also somewhat complicated. Right. There are two separate holidays, as it were, that we tend to refer to collectively as Pesach. But in the Torah, we first hear about the holiday of Pesach, which happens on the 14th day of the month of Nisan. And that's the day on which the Korban Pesach is brought, is sacrificed, right? It's what we would call today, since we do not have a Korban Pesach, that would just be, Erev Pesach. That night is the night that we have the Seder. But back in the days when they would bring the Korban Pesach, that was done on the 14th day of Nisan. And you eat the Korban Pesach, as we will see in more detail in a moment, with matzot on the 14th day of Nisan. So that's the context that this pasuk in Dvarim is talking about matzot. Lo tochal alav chametz shivat yamim tochal alav matzot lechem oni. So for 7 days, you will then eat matzot, which is then referred to as lechem oni. This is the one place in the Torah where it's referred to as lechem oni. So you have the day of the Korban Pesach where you eat the Korban Pesach with matzot, and then you have 7 days which follow where you eat matzot as well. That is referred to in the Torah as Chag HaMatzot. So you have Pesach, which is the 14th day, and Chag HaMatzot, which begins on the 15th day. And then the pasuk goes on to continue. Ki b'chipazon yatzata me'eretz Mitzrayim. Why do we eat matzot? Because we left Egypt in a hurry. Leman tizkor ad yom tzedcha me'eretz Mitzrayim kol yemei chayecha. Right, and we eat the matzot for 7 days in order to remember the day that we left Egypt. Okay, but back to the phrase of lechem oni. Right, the Torah refers here to the matzot as lechem oni. So if you see in the English translation, it's referred to, they translate it as the bread of affliction. But that's not the only way that you could translate the word lechem oni. So I brought a smattering of mefarshim, of commentators, to try to understand what this phrase lechem oni is. So Rashi says, lechem oni, lechem shemaskir et ha'oni shenit'anu b'Mitzrayim. Right. So the word oni, one meaning of oni is, as we saw in the English translation, affliction. So the lechem oni is meant to remind us of the affliction of Egypt, right? Of the experience of the affliction of Egypt. Sforno, and there are other commentaries on this. I just brought a handful. Sforno says, lechem oni, lechem shehayu ochlim ba'oni, ושלא היה להם פנאי להשעות עיסתם עד שתחמץ מפני נוגסים עצים. Right? So he would also he might be referring to the same translation that Rashi says, that oni is affliction, but that lechem oni is the bread that you eat when you don't have time, when your time isn't your own and you don't have time to let bread become fermented, to become chametz, right? So this has to do with the process of bread making. Unlike today, where we use yeast to make bread very, very quickly, back then all bread was fermented, what we call today sourdough, right? Which is a much longer process of baking bread. If you're a slave, you don't have time to be making real bread all of the time, and so therefore the matzot, which were not fermented, right, which were not chametz, were more in keeping with what slaves probably were making on a regular basis, right? When they didn't have time, the time was not their own, right? Being in control of your time is the definition of a free person. Not being in control of your time is a definition of a slave. And the Chizkuni says something similar. Lechem ani. Darko shel ani shenotnim lo me'at kemach. Right? So he as opposed to the Sforno, where he might be translating it as the like Rashi, like the bread of affliction, right? More likely, affliction. The Chizkuni uses the other translation of oni, which is not so much affliction, but of being poor, of being a poor person. Lechem ani, darko shel ani shenotnim lo me'at kemach. אין לו כלי להחם בו המים, ללושו, ולא פנאי להחמיץ, אלא בוללו מבעט מים, צוננין וזרקו בתנור או בחירה. Right? So he also referring to the process of bread making and the fact that a slave simply does not have time for that, says that the way of a poor person is that that they make this very simple bread, right? Matzot. And why? Because they don't have any container in which to heat up water, and they don't have the time to sit around waiting for the bread to become chametz, right, for the bread to ferment, right? Rather, they just mix a little water and flour together, they throw it into the fire, and that's what they eat, right? And that's essentially what matzot are, right? So either it's the definition of affliction, right? That's what it's like to be a slave, where you don't have control over your time, or very simply a poor person who doesn't have the means or the time to be luxuriating in the process of bread baking. So lechem oni, according to these various translations, either means, right, the bread of affliction or the bread of the poor bread. Right? I'll throw into this mix the other possibility that lechem oni might simply be poor bread in the sense of not poor of the bread of the poor, but bread which itself is poor, right? Bread which has no taste and no body to it, right? There's nothing to matzot. It's a piece of flat bread with very little to say for itself, right? So the bread itself is poor, and that is another possibility. And then, of course, there's the other explanation, which is brought in the Gemara, a midrash of sorts, lechem oni, lechem she'onim alav harbe. Bread which you either speak about or sing about a lot, meaning it's bread that we talk about a lot. And while that's clearly not the pshat of what the pasuk is talking about, it certainly is true, right? That the meaning and the depth of this bread that we have on a holiday Pesach we have a lot to say about it, and it is very deep in meaning, if not in flavor. And so even if that might not be the pshat of the pasuk or even of the Haggadah, it certainly is true. And I think that is what it's all of these explanations that I think we're going to try to get to the bottom of in our class together tonight. So if we're going back to the Haggadah for a moment, right? This is the lechem oni that we ate in Mitzrayim. So basically what the Haggadah is telling us is that somehow this is connected to our experience in Mitzrayim, and we break the matzah in half to somehow symbolize this, right? Either to take the already poor bread and make it even poorer, right? Or or as many explain, that a poor person never eats a whole piece of bread. They're constantly breaking their food in half to make it last longer. Right? And so in whatever exact way you want to explain it, that's what Yachatz is all about, right? But I would like to suggest, and I don't think this is necessarily the pshat of what Yachatz, the breaking in two, is about, but I would like to look a little bit further into understanding the symbolism of matzot, of what lechem oni is, or matzah in general, to try to understand what it's all about. What is the symbolism of this unleavened bread, unfermented bread that we eat throughout the holiday of Pesach, and we'll see that appropriately. I think there are two different ways of looking at matzah, which come across in the sources, and so it's another layer of understanding and appropriateness of the breaking into of the matzah. So let's take a step back and look at the sources which discuss the origin of matzah and Pesach. So everybody knows, right, from the earliest memories that we have of learning about the holiday of Pesach, that the reason that we eat matzot is because Bnei Israel were leaving Mitzrayim in a hurry, and they didn't have time for their bread to rise or to ferment, or more precisely. Vatechazak Mitzrayim al ha'am lemaher l'sholcham, right? This is after Makat Becharot, right? The firstborn Egyptians have all died, right? And now suddenly the Egyptians are very eager to get Bnei Israel out the door. So they push them out. They are urgent upon the people to send them out of the land in haste. Ki amru anachnu kulanu metim, because they said we are all dying, we are all dead. Vayisa ha'am et bitseko terem yachmatz, and the people took up their dough before it had become chametz, before it had soured, meaning had fermented. Mish'arotam tzrurot besimlotam al shichmam, right? So they took it bound up in their clothing on their shoulders. This might, by the way, just as a side point, indicate that maybe Bnei Israel in Egypt were not always eating matzot, because it says that they took their bread before it had become leavened, meaning that the intention when they mixed their dough together was that it should have become leavened, but it did not. But they did not have time. Now it's possible that this was a particular dough that they were making on the eve of the Exodus. They were no longer technically slaves. Nevertheless, right, just to point out that in this case, for sure, they were intending to make regular bread. And then a few psukim later, that's pasuk lamed daled and pasuk lamed tet, they have left Egypt, and then it says vayofu et habatek asher hotziu mimitzrayim ugot matzot ki lo chametz ki garshu mimitzrayim velo yuchlu lihitmameh vegam seda lo asu lahem. Right, so they are able to stop, and they baked their unleavened cakes of bread, of dough, which they took out because it had not become chametz, because they had been rushed out. They were not allowed to hesitate, and they were rushed out of Egypt. And then it says v'gam tzeda lo asu lahem, and they hadn't prepared anything else to take with them. So this was basically what they had to eat. And this, as we all know, is the reason that we eat matzot on the holiday of Chag HaMatzot. And this is also what it says in the Haggadah towards the end of Magid, right, when we point out the Pesach, Matzah, Umaror, and we give explanation of those three main elements of Leil HaSeder. So this is the explanation that is brought for the matzot, right? Because, again, we were rushed out of Egypt and did not have time for our dough to become chametz. Now, what's interesting about this explanation of matzot and why we eat it is that matzot make an appearance in Sefer Shmot prior to that event, right? Those psukim which I just read to you were towards the end of Perek Yud Bet in Shmot. Earlier on in Perek Yud Bet, we hear about the laws of the Korban Pesach, which they are going to have to bring, right? When at the beginning of the month of Nisan, they are told what they're going to have to do, which includes sacrificing the Korban Pesach and all the details of the Korban Pesach. So it says there earlier in Perek Yud Bet, ve'achlu et habasar b'layla hazeh tzli eish umatzot u'morim yachlu. Right, they'll eat it on that night. It should be roasted in fire, and they should eat it with matzot and bitter herbs. Okay, so part of the law of the Korban Pesach is they have to eat it with matzot. And then it goes on to explain that you have to eat it. You don't eat it raw or cooked in water, but it has to be roasted. And all various laws about the Korban Pesach. You're not allowed to leave any over for the next day. And then the last pasuk Yud Aleph, v'chacha tochlo oto matnechem chagurim na'alchem be'raglechem u'makachem b'yadchem. You have to be dressed, ready to head out the door. V'achaltem oto b'chipazon pesach hu l'Hashem. And you have to eat it in a hurried manner, in haste. This is the Pesach for Hashem. So what's interesting about this is that these laws, including the fact that you have to eat the matzot with the Korban Pesach, all appear before the events of being rushed out of Egypt and not being able to wait for their dough to become chametz. So the matzot already appear with the Korban Pesach, which leads one to believe that there's some significance to matzot that is independent of the events that occurred afterwards, the events of being pushed out of Mitzrayim quickly. And so we need to try to understand not only the significance of matzot because they were rushed out, which we already saw, but also the significance of the matzot that was eaten with the Korban Pesach. So one thing that we notice from these psukim about the matzot here is the context in which the matzot are mentioned, which obviously is the eating of the Korban Pesach, but specifically all of these very particular laws about the Korban Pesach, which all in some way or another, or mostly all seem to somehow be connected to the idea of chipazon, the idea that Bnei Israel were commanded that they had to eat the Korban Pesach hastily. And so many of these laws could be understood in that context, right? The fact that it had to be roasted and not cooked in water, because roasting is a quicker way of cooking. Obviously, the laws that they have to be, dressed with their shoes on and their walking sticks in their hand. That's all talking about the haste. They have to be ready to walk out the door. There are some that say that even the fact that they're not allowed to leave any over for the next day, right? Because not everyone agrees with this opinion, but it could be because, in other words, they're not going to be sitting around eating it the next day. It has to be all finished up that night. This law is not mentioned here, but elsewhere it says that you're not allowed to break the bones of the Korban Pesach, right? So some people say because the custom, I don't know if custom is the right word, but the habit was that people would break the bones and eat the marrow inside. But that was kind of the sign of a meal that you were kind of luxuriating over. And they didn't have time for that. They weren't going to be sitting there sucking the bones of their meal. And of course, most significantly, the use of matzot. That matzot, right, as we have mentioned, is the kind of bread that you make when you are in a hurry or when you don't have any time. And because while, again, bread baking was a very long process, baking matzot was something that you could do very quickly. Another example of this, independent of the story of Pesach, is, for example, the story of Lot and his visitors, the Malachim who come to him. It says that as part of the meal that Lot prepared for them, he made matzot. So, right, why matzot? So, right, of course, Rashi says that is because it was Pesach, and that is a fascinating comment, which deserves its own shiur. But the pshat is that he was in a rush. He wasn't expecting these guests, so he had to make something. He had to prepare something that he could make very quickly, right? So he makes matzot. He can't wait around to make bread for them, right? So here also matzot is something they can prepare quickly, so they can eat this korban pesach b'chipazon and head quickly the door. Now it's important to note that the idea of eating matzot with a sacrifice is not unique to Korban Pesach. In fact, almost all korbanot, which include some sort of bread, some sort of grain cake of sorts, almost all the korbanot would have some sort of bread with it that was not chametz. There are a couple of very specific exceptions to this rule where chametz was allowed on the mizbeach in the Beit HaMikdash. But the rule was that it had to be matza. It had to be unleavened, unfermented bread. So on that topic, right, about korbanot in general, or that in the Beit HaMikdash in general, there was no chametz, the Sefer HaChinuch explains why this is. Why are you not allowed to have chametz, or specifically, the pasuk says seor on the mizbech. Just a quick explanation, if there's someone who's not as familiar with this terminology. Seor is what today we would call a sourdough starter. That's a very fermented piece of dough that is used to ferment more dough from which you make bread. Okay, so that's the sourdough starter is what the Torah calls seor. The bread that you make out of a sourdough starter, out of seor, is called chametz, or another word for it is machmetzet. Machmetzet and chametz are essentially synonyms in the Torah, and both of those things, both the seor and the chametz machmetzet, are not allowed on Pesach, and also not on the mizbeach for the most part, right? So the Sefer HaChinuch, which is a book, if there's someone who's not familiar with the book, which lists all of the mitzvot of the Torah, and also usually gives some sort of explanation of the mitzvah. So here he says the following. Since korbanot in general are meant to kind of make the person who is sacrificing the sacrifice think certain types of thoughts, as we have written elsewhere about korbanot, ועל כן, בהרחיק החמץ, שהוא נעשה בשהייה גדולה, מקורבנו, ייקח דמיון לקנות מידת הזריזות והקלות והמהירות במעשה השם ברוך הוא. Right, so he's saying by keeping away from chametz on the mizbeach, right? We're keeping away, and because chametz is something which only happens with a lot of waiting. It's a very slow kind of process. So by keeping that out of the mizbeach, we're sending the message to the person who is sacrificing the sacrifice, the quality of zrizut, of alacrity and haste and quickness when it comes to things having to do with God, right? Having to do with the service, the worship of God. Right, because that's the goal, that you want to worship God with alacrity, with haste, not in a sluggish sort of manner. And so that the Sefer HaChinuch explains is the reason that you're not in general allowed to have chametz on the mizbeach. So it's interesting what he says when we go back to the context of the Korban Pesach, because he saw that the Korban Pesach is all about haste. It's all about being quick to rush out the door, to leave Mitzrayim, right? To rush towards the Geula. And so it makes a lot of sense that that even more than a regular Korban, than in the Korban Pesach, they would be choosing that they would be sacrificing or eating the Korban Pesach with matzot, this symbol of alacrity, as opposed to bread. So what he's saying here is very appropriate for Korban Pesach. So I once heard. So I remember after one day in shul, the day after the Seder, friends of mine came up to me. I worked for a while in a sourdough bakery, so for a while I was kind of like the address for all thoughts having to do with sourdough bread. And these people, I guess, had learned recently about how sourdough works and how the interesting thing about seor, as the Jewish people deal with it as opposed to the rest of the world, is that seor and machmetzet usually is something that is around for a very long time. There are bakeries in Europe where they have their seor, their sourdough starter, for literally centuries, right? Where the same, the idea of a sourdough starter is that you always leave a little bit left over so that you can continue your sourdough starter. And it collects all sorts of flavor and it becomes very strong. And, bakeries pride themselves on their sourdough, their starter. The Jewish people have this problem, which is a fascinating other topic of, customs of Jewish communities around the world, how they dealt with making bread the day after Pesach. The problem is that they throw this thing out once a year. They somehow have to deal with the fact that they're not allowed to have it on Pesach. And so somebody came to me the day after Pesach and they said, that's what's happening here, right? That the Egyptians, who were actually, by the way, famous for bread baking, it's known, in the studies of ancient Egypt that they very well knew and might actually have been the creators, the first people to have figured out how to do sourdough baking. That it's so appropriate, these people said to me, that when they were leaving Egypt, they were leaving that behind. They were saying, we're stopping that sourdough now. That thing that is so associated with Egypt, we're going to stop and we're going to start our own, right? It's like a real stopping point. It's like a real break between the culture, literally and figuratively, in all senses of the word culture, a break with the culture of Egypt, to start their own, to start afresh. So I think that that is connected somehow to this, the symbolism of this alacrity, right? That we're not like easing our way out the door. We're not slowly, sluggishly deciding, okay, we're going to leave now. That's it. We're making a clean break and we're out of here. We're leaving, right? And that is one symbolism of matza, right? That clean break, that swift exit to leave Egypt finally, once and for all. But if you look at other commentaries, we see that there are other ideas about chametz and about matzah, which give us a different understanding of what matzah is all about. So, for example, if you look at the Perush of the Netziv, right, in Hamek Davar, he first, in the first paragraph, he also explains the idea of not having chametz on the mizbeach at all, and then he talks specifically about Pesach. So, what does he say? Kikol seor v'chol dvash, right? Kara hakatuv. Okay, we can skip this part. That's the lesson part. Ubasher sheseor hu emtzai hanaaseh b'yedei adam. Lahosif al habriya me haborei yitbarach al yedei tachbulot b'nei adam. Right, since seor, right, sourdough starter or sourdough in general, is something which is created, right, by the actions of people, by the ingenuity of humans, something which is added on to what God himself has done, right? Mishum hachi hizira katuv beveit hamikdash lamdenu dekol hamitkarev yoter laHashem ra'ui lema'et yoter betachpulot enosh. So why do we not have this on the altar in the Beit HaMikdash? Because when you're worshiping God, you want to minimize human contributions to the world and emphasize what God himself has done, right? To strengthen the connection to God as opposed to emphasizing what humans have done. Right, so that, he says, is the reason why we do not have seor or chametz on the mizbeach. And then when he talks about the same idea, having to do specifically with Pesach. V'lo yachel chametz, kedei lahashrish hazechira belev al yedei eze pu'ula hamar'a u'maskir ze ha'inyan. Tziveti shelo yachel chametz. Right. So in order to entrench into the minds of the people this specific idea, that is why you're not allowed to eat chametz on Pesach. De matzah ein ba yitaron ayidei tachpulot yedei ha'adam lahalot ha'isa yoter mehakemach v'hamayim sheniveim mimenu yitzbarach. Right, that matzah is basically just flour and water. Right, you mix flour and water, you throw it into the fire, and that is it. There is nothing else to it. Right, all things which are God-given. Right, ma she'en ken chametz. שולט בתחפולות האדם להעלות העיסה על ידי שאור, משום הכי הוא אות שקיום ישראל הוא רק ברוח השם. Right, so why at this specific moment, when we remember Yetziat Mitzrayim, do we have matzot and not bread? Because that is the moment we want to remember shehakol me'Hashem, that everything was done by God, right? That our whole existence is due to what Hashem did for us, and not what anything that we did, right? And this very much ties into the themes of Leil HaSeder, right? Where we emphasize, lo ayedei malach, v'lo ayedei saraf, v'lo ayedei shaliach, right? That the Yetziat Mitzrayim was done not by an angel, not by some sort of messenger, Ela HaKadosh Baruch Hu himself, right? HaKadosh Baruch Hu himself led us out of Mitzrayim, redeemed us from slavery in Egypt, right? The idea that Moshe Rabbeinu does not appear in the Haggadah also emphasizes the idea that our redemption was done directly by God. And that's how he explains the significance of matzot on Pesach, right? Where we're trying to emphasize God's hand, right, and not our human hand. So that's one idea of how we can understand the significance of eating matzot at this moment. There's another idea mentioned by Rav Yoel Ben Nun, where he adds on another interesting concept about chametz and matza and their significance, specifically, in the context that we have been talking about. Hachametz v'gam hadvash, right? He's talking now about the korbanot. Hachametz v'gam hadvash. Hem hayad v'hatachlit hasofit alehem sho'ef hachaklai hamegadel mereshit avodato. That chametz, meaning bread, right? Good, soft, crusty, delicious, flavorful bread, right? And dvash, right? The dvash that we make from dates, from grapes, from figs. That's the end product, right? When the farmer is planting his wheat, when the farmer is growing his fruit, that's what he wants to get to, right? That is the goal. Lechem hachametz v'hapri habashel v'hamatok hem bitui mutzlach lesof hatahlich, right? Again, these things are the expression of the end of the process. The tachlit hanichsefet, right? The end that we are all yearning for. Ulefichach gam leosher ulehatzlacha, libracha uleshefa, right? So therefore, it is also a symbol of wealth and success and blessing and plenty. Shel mi shemesig et hatachlit hanichsefet umagia el sof hatalich, right? It's the symbol of someone who has achieved the desired goal and has reached the end of the process. Leumatam, right? On the other hand, hamatza mevatet et atzirat hatahlich beemtzao b'terem higia letachlito. Matzah, on the other hand, it symbolizes the exact opposite. It symbolizes something being stopped in the middle of the process, right? Something which hasn't reached its final goal. There's a perush on the psukim that we looked at in Shemot Perek Yud Bet, right, which describe those moments when Bnei Israel were leaving Egypt and not able to allow their dough to reach its final product. So he describes there, it's fascinating because it shows very clearly how well he understood the process of bread baking, which of course in his days was the way that bread was baked all the time. But he explains how, as opposed to how we make matzah today, the matzot that Bnei Israel ate on the night that they left Egypt was bread that didn't reach its potential, or bread which was stopped, as the Rav Yoel Ben Nun is explaining here, before it had reached its final potential. Meaning what? He says when they started baking their bread, when they mixed their dough, they meant to make bread, right? Their goal was to make bread. And so he says, it's not like our matzot where we don't put seor in. We don't put any yeast, in our days, yeast or sourdough into the dough, right? It's just flour and water. He's like, no, they were making bread, right? They had intended to have sourdough that night, right? So they put seor in their dough. But what happened? They didn't have time, right? Lo yochlu lehit ma'amea, right? And it takes a long time for bread to ferment. And not only that, but they were leaving at night, right? And they were in a rush, so they didn't have time to boil water and make the dough warm and have the heat of the sun warm their dough so that the fermentation process would be sped up. No, they were leaving at night. So they didn't have time, and they didn't have the warmth. Two things which are needed in order to hasten the process of making bread, right? And so they had to pick up that dough and bake it prematurely, right? Bake it before it was ready to be baked. And this is as opposed to how we make matzot nowadays for the holiday Pesach. Basically, the laws of matzah baking are, a whole list of ways that we can make sure that our bread does not turn in, that our dough does not turn into bread. Basically, all the things that we have to do to make sure that absolutely nothing happens to our dough. So what do? If for making bread, you want, let's say, a wetter dough will ferment quicker. So matzot are often made, although not always, there are different customs, but often, particularly by those who were most concerned about, piling on all sorts of stringencies about matzah baking, you make it with a very, very dry dough, right? Because dry dough will ferment much less quickly than a wet dough. We do it within 18 minutes, because what happens in 18 minutes? Absolutely nothing, right? Nothing happens in 18 minutes. And therefore, if you make sure to finish making the matzot before 18 minutes, you could be 100% sure that nothing has happened to your dough. We use water which has rested overnight, because nighttime is cooler, and it makes our water cold, which makes the dough colder, which makes it less likely to ferment. We're not allowed to let the dough of the matzot, from the minute the water hits the flour, you're not allowed to let it sit still, because dough that sits still is dough that is going to ferment more quickly, right? So all of the halachot of matzah baking are basically, how are we going to stop the process? How are we going to make sure that nothing happens to our dough, that there's not a chance in the world that any fermentation will take place? But as the Shadal emphasizes, that's not what they were doing on the night that they actually left Egypt. They intended to make bread, but the process was stopped, right, prematurely. And so they ended up with matzot, which is why we eat matzot for 7 or 8 days every year, right? So, as Rav Yoel Binod explains, right, matzot is bread, hamatzah mevatet et ha'atzirat ha'talich be'emtza'o, b'terem higia letachlito, right? It symbolizes the process that did not reach its final goal. והיא בבחינת חיסרון המצפה עדיין להשלמת השלמות. Right, so matzot symbolizes our waiting for perfection, right? That we don't have the perfection now. Everything is not completed yet, right? Rather, we are still looking ahead for when the process will be complete. Lachen, therefore, gam mutzeget hamatzah lechem oni, and that's why it's called lechem oni, right? I kind of hinted to this earlier. One possibility is that the bread itself is poor, right? It is a bread that hasn't reached its potential. Hamatzah hen באופן סמלי והן מבחינה מעשית הוא לחמו של העני, right? In all ways, it is the bread of a poor person. שאין בידו כוח ויכולת להביא את התהליך החומרי לתכלית השלמה של העוגה היפה, right? It's poor bread because both in the way that it's made and the people who tended to make it don't have the capability, because of the circumstances, to reach the uga hayafa, to the final loaf, right? Rather, they're left with matzot, lu'umatzot, right? In contrast, haseor hamatfiach et ha'isa ade gluska shemena hu simlo shel bal hakoach ha'ashir hamedushan ubal hayecholet. On the other hand, seor, machmetzet, chametz, bread, right? That's the symbol of wealth and richness and the opposite of lechem oni. Right? So and so that he's going to go on in a moment to explain is the reason that we eat it on Chag HaMatzot, right? Because he says we would think that the moment that we stopped being slaves, the moment of the Geula, of the redemption, of Yetziat Mitzrayim, then that is the moment where we can eat the bread, right? Where we can say we've reached the goal, right? We have achieved what we were trying to achieve. But the matzot symbolize the fact, Rav Yoel Ben Nun says, that we haven't reached the goal yet, right? This is just the beginning of the process, right? And when is the end of the process? The end of the process, well, is twofold, right? On the one hand, there were two goals when leaving Egypt, right, that night. There was the goal of reaching Har Sinai and receiving the Torah. And then there was the other goal of reaching Eretz Yisrael, right? So those two things are the end of the process, the end of those are the final goal, which was only started when they left Egypt, right? And when do we symbolically reach those two goals? That's what happens at the end, a little bit later when we reach the holiday of Shavuot, right? Shavuot is both Chag Matan Torah and Chag HaBikurim, right? Chag Matan Torah, of course, being the holiday where we celebrate receiving the Torah, and Chag HaBikurim, the day that we celebrate that we are in the land and we are offering up our first fruits to God, right? Those together symbolize the end of the process of leaving matzot. And as I just saw in the comments now, yes, that Shavuot is one of the very specific exceptions to the rule where we bring chametz on the mizbeach, right? Specifically on Shavuot, when it's the end of the process, right? When we've reached Eretz Yisrael, when we are able to celebrate the receiving of the Torah, that's when we bring chametz on the mizbeach, right? Because that symbolizes the end of the process, the goal, the final goal that we are reaching. I think that the Seder, Leil HaSeder, as we celebrate it today, and how it's been celebrated actually at this point in history for a very, very long time, I feel that this understanding of matzah is all the more meaningful, right? Because as we make our way through the Seder, we see all sorts of contrasts, all sorts of themes fluctuating throughout the night, right? We start off talking about when we were in Egypt, and then we talk about, of course, we talk about Yetziat Mitzrayim, but somehow in the middle of the Seder, we start talking about the Beit HaMikdash and about the future and about Geula that has not yet happened, right? And we who are kind of in this limbo situation where we're celebrating the Geula, but also waiting for the Geula, all of which is expressed in Leil HaSeder itself, throughout the Haggadah. So we experience exactly this message of the matzot, right? Where that although we have Geula, although we are no longer slaves in Egypt, of course, and yet we are still somehow in a tahalich, like we're still in a process, right? And so that Pesach, right, is all about that process, is about looking forward, trying to reach that final goal, right, whenever it is that we may get there. So back to where we started with the Yachatz, with the splitting. So I think that even though I'm not sure that that's pshat in the Seder, I'm not sure that that's what the actual breaking of the matzah is meant to be, right? But I think it certainly can symbolize the fact that the matzah itself has two sides to it. It's the matzah which showed our quick leaving of Egypt, our commitment to leaving all of Egypt behind, right, and all of the greatness of that moment of Geula. But it also emphasizes that it's just at that moment of the Gula, it was really just the beginning of the process of Gula, and that the ultimate and final Gula was only going to happen at some point in the future. So I'm going to look now, see if there were any comments that I didn't have a chance to catch. Nope, just that one, which I actually did see. If anyone else has any questions or comments, I'm happy to hear it. And otherwise, I encourage everybody to continue with this wonderful series of Web Yeshiva onto the other classes that will be happening over the next couple of days, to have a little tidbit for each of the days of the each of the stages of the Seder. All right. Well, a little bit early, but Pesach Kasher v'Sameach to everybody, and have a good rest of your day. You're very welcome.